Let me start with something that rarely gets said out loud. People who love others more than themselves are not naturally selfless. They are not simply kind or generous or good-hearted. They are not blessed with exceptional empathy that makes giving easy. What they are is deeply conditioned to believe that their own needs, desires, and pain matter less than everyone else's, that their worth is measured by what they provide, that loving themselves is somehow selfish, while loving everyone else is virtuous. Loving others more than yourself doesn't always look like the noble version people imagine. It doesn't look like saints or martyrs making conscious sacrifice for greater good. Sometimes it looks like saying yes when every part of you wants to say no, always being available when someone calls, putting your own plans aside without hesitation, listening to the same friend's problems for hours while never mentioning your own. Staying in relationships where you give everything and receive almost nothing. It looks like being the reliable one, the understanding one, the one who never asks for anything in return. These are often highly aware people. They know they do this. They can see the pattern when they look for it. They understand intellectually that they're depleting themselves. They've read the articles about self-care, heard the advice about boundaries, talked about it in therapy. And still, when someone needs them, something inside compels them to give. The knowledge doesn't stop the pattern. The awareness doesn't prevent the automatic yes. What makes this pattern so difficult to see clearly is that it doesn't feel like a problem from the inside. It feels like who they are, like their nature, like the way they're built to move through the world. The idea that this might be conditioning rather than character, learned behaviour rather than inherent goodness, feels threatening to their entire sense of self. The outside appearance is generous, supportive, selfless. The person seems emotionally available, endlessly patient, deeply caring. They're the ones friends rely on, family turns to, partners appreciate for being so easy, so understanding, so flexible. From the outside, it can look like beautiful compassion. From the inside, it feels like obligation that cannot be questioned, like duty that has no end. This pattern shows up everywhere. In romantic relationships where they tolerate behaviour they would never accept if it were happening to someone they loved. In friendships that drain them but continue because ending them feels cruel. In family dynamics where they remain the emotional support while receiving none. In work environments where they take on everyone else's tasks. The pattern doesn't discriminate. It touches every area of life. And that's exactly where the pattern begins. It usually starts long before they can remember. Long before they develop language for what's happening. Long before they understand that not everyone experiences love this way. The pattern forms in childhood, often in families that look perfectly fine from the outside. There is no single traumatic event, no obvious abuse, just a slow, steady teaching that some people's needs matter more than others, and the child learns, without anyone saying it directly, that they are in the second category. The child learns that connection depends on not being a problem, that love appears when they're helpful and disappears when they're needy, that the adults in their life have struggles more important than a child's simple needs. Maybe the parent is dealing with illness, depression, addiction, financial stress. Maybe the parent is just emotionally unavailable, physically present but not really there. The child's needs don't get met not because they're bad, but because the parent cannot meet them. Over time, the child stops asking stops expecting, stops believing that their needs deserve attention. This happens so gradually that there's no moment of decision, just a slow fading of the voice that says, "I need something." The child learns to read the room before entering it, to gauge the emotional temperature before speaking, to suppress their own distress to avoid adding to the household burden. What they often experience is role reversal. The child becomes emotional support for the parent, becomes the one who listens to adult problems, who comforts, who tries to fix things far beyond their capacity. This role feels important. It makes them feel needed, valuable, necessary. But it also teaches them that their value comes from service, not from simply existing. Many people who love others more than themselves grew up being praised for being so mature or such a good kid or no trouble at all. The praise reinforced the suppression. Being easy became identity. Not having needs became source of pride. They learned to feel good about disappearing, about making themselves small, about requiring nothing. Another common origin is growing up with siblings who needed more attention. Maybe a sibling with illness, disability, behavioural problems. The attention naturally flowed toward the child who needed more, and the child who needed less learned not to compete for it. They learned to be the easy one, the self-sufficient one, the one parents didn't have to worry about. This felt like helping the family. It was also abandoning themselves. Some learned this pattern in families where expressing needs was met with anger, guilt, or punishment, where asking for help was treated as weakness, where crying was responded to with dismissal or contempt. The child learns quickly that needs create problems, that the safest strategy is to have none. So they develop the capacity to override their own signals, to suppress their own truth, to function as if they require nothing. Others grew up in families where love was conditional, where approval had to be earned through achievement, through helpfulness, through being what the parent needed them to be. They learned that love is transactional, that it must be purchased with good behaviour, with service, with self-denial. They never experienced being loved simply for existing. Over time, these children internalise a belief so deep it becomes invisible. The belief that everyone else's needs are more important than their own, that their pain is less real, less urgent, less worthy of attention than others' pain. That taking care of themselves is selfish, while taking care of everyone else is good. This belief becomes the foundation everything else builds on. The absence of anyone asking, "What do you need?" leaves a mark. When children grow up without their needs being noticed, named, or met, they don't learn that needs are normal. They learn that needs are burden. They don't develop the capacity to advocate for themselves because no one modelled that this was possible or acceptable. This is how a child learns that other people's needs are emergencies while their own needs are inconveniences. And this becomes the foundation for every relationship that follows. By adolescence, the pattern is already deeply established. It doesn't feel like a pattern. It feels like identity, like who they are at their core. In adolescence, while others are experimenting with boundaries and rebellion, people who love others more than themselves are perfecting the art of self-erasure. They become the friend everyone goes to with problems, the one who listens for hours, the one who cancels their own plans to help. And they tell themselves this is just who they are. Being needed feels like purpose. Being the helper feels like having value. They build identity around this role because it's the identity that received approval, that created connection, that made them matter. Without the role, They fear they're nothing, so they commit to it completely. Their friendships during this time become training ground for adult patterns. They're always the listener, never the talker, always available, never busy with their own life, always supportive, never requiring support. This imbalance doesn't register as problem because it feels normal. It feels like what friendship is supposed to be. The inability to say no without overwhelming guilt begins here. When someone asks for their time, their help, their energy, saying no feels like betrayal, feels like being cruel, feels like violating who they're supposed to be. So they say yes even when yes means sacrificing something important to them, even when yes means depleting themselves, even when yes feels more like obligation than choice. First romantic relationships often show the same pattern. They give everything. They accommodate completely. They make themselves endlessly available. They tolerate behaviour that hurts them because ending the relationship feels mean. They become whatever the other person needs because that's what they learned love requires. Their own needs, their own preferences, their own boundaries, these don't enter the equation. What they don't realise yet is how exhausting this is becoming. They notice they're tired. They notice relationships feel one-sided. But they attribute this to their own inadequacy. If they were better at this, stronger, more capable, it wouldn't be so hard. They never consider that the problem is the pattern itself, that what they're doing is unsustainable by design. Another aspect of adolescence is the terror of being seen as selfish. Selfish becomes the worst possible thing they could be. They police themselves constantly for any sign of selfishness. Thinking about their own needs feels selfish. Expressing preferences feels selfish. Saying no feels selfish. So they avoid all of it, becoming smaller and smaller in their own life. They also learn to feel pride in not being needy. They look at people who ask for help, who express needs, who expect reciprocity, and feel somehow superior for not requiring these things. The pride masks the wound. They're not actually free from needs. They've just become expert at suppressing them. The people-pleasing that characterises this phase feels like virtue, feels like being a good person. They don't recognise it as survival strategy formed in childhood. Don't see how it's costing them their sense of self. Don't understand that pleasing everyone means betraying themselves. By the end of adolescence, they've built entire identity around being the helper, the reliable one, the one who doesn't need anything, and this identity will follow them into every adult relationship they form. What they don't realise is that being needed is not the same as being loved. And building identity around usefulness is building on sand. As they move into adulthood, the pattern becomes more sophisticated. It learns to look like maturity, like emotional intelligence, like strength. But underneath, it's still the same calculation. Everyone else first, self last. In adulthood, people who love others more than themselves often appear remarkably well adjusted. They seem generous, emotionally available, deeply caring. They're the ones friends call in crisis, the ones family relies on, the ones partners appreciate for being so understanding, so flexible, so easy. The automatic prioritization of others' needs happens without thought. Someone expresses need and they respond immediately. It doesn't matter if they're exhausted, doesn't matter if they have their own problems, doesn't matter if this person has never reciprocated. The need activates the response and they give. This automation means they're often giving before they've even registered their own state, before they've asked themselves if they have capacity, before they've considered whether this is their responsibility. Another pattern in adult relationships is the inability to receive care without immediately reciprocating. When someone offers help, support, kindness, they feel uncomfortable, indebted. Like they need to give something back immediately to even the score. The idea of simply receiving, of being cared for without earning it, without paying it back, creates anxiety, so they deflect care, minimize their needs, or immediately return the favour so they don't have to sit with the vulnerability of having received. They become everyone's emotional support but have no one to lean on. Not because people wouldn't help if asked, but because they cannot ask, cannot admit they're struggling, cannot reach out for support without feeling ashamed. So they carry everything alone while everyone around them assumes they're fine because they seem fine. The isolation this creates is profound. Over time, they also develop a pattern of attracting people who take more than they give. The givers attract the takers. People who are comfortable receiving without reciprocating find them instinctively. People who need someone to manage their emotions, solve their problems, support them endlessly. These people recognize someone who will do it. And because the person who loves others more than themselves has no framework for expecting reciprocity, they don't recognize these relationships as unbalanced. They think this is normal. How they rationalize others' selfishness is remarkable. When someone takes advantage, when someone uses them, when someone shows up only when they need something, they make excuses. They tell themselves the person is going through a hard time, the person is busy, the person cares but shows it differently. They create elaborate justifications for why relationships are one-sided, rather than acknowledging they're being used. They also stay in relationships long past when they should leave. Romantic relationships where they're doing all the emotional work, giving all the support, making all the compromises, friendships that drain them, family dynamics that hurt them. They stay because leaving feels cruel, because the other person needs them, because walking away would make them the bad person. So they endure, hoping things will change, believing if they just give more it will eventually be enough. The exhaustion of being everyone's source of support builds gradually. At first they can handle it. They're strong, capable, resilient. But over months and years the depletion accumulates. They're tired in ways sleep doesn't fix. They feel empty. They notice they're irritable, disconnected, going through motions. But they don't connect this to the pattern. They think something is wrong with them. They blame themselves for not being strong enough. Another dimension is how they feel guilty for having needs. The rare times when they need support, when they're struggling, when they require help, they feel ashamed, like they're failing, like they're being burdened. So even when they desperately need care, they hide it. They perform being fine. They wait until they're alone to fall apart, then pull themselves together before anyone sees. The resentment that builds underneath all the giving is quiet, suppressed, sometimes completely unconscious. But it's there, accumulating with every unreciprocated gesture, every one-sided conversation, every time they showed up and no one showed up for them. They cannot acknowledge the resentment without feeling like a terrible person. So they push it down, but it leaks out in passive comments, in sudden irritability, in the exhaustion that feels like more than tiredness. This kind of giving doesn't feel optional, it feels like who they are, and that's exactly the problem. The pattern doesn't just live in their relationships, it lives in their body. In the chronic tension, the persistent fatigue, the illnesses that seem to appear from nowhere, the body keeps score of every time they said yes when they meant no, every time they suppressed their own needs, every time they swallowed their truth to keep someone else comfortable. And eventually the body presents the bill. Chronic fatigue is often the first sign. They're tired all the time, not the normal tired that comes from a busy day, a deep, persistent exhaustion that sleep doesn't touch. They wake up tired. They go through the day tired. They go to bed exhausted. Rest doesn't restore them because the depletion isn't physical. It's the cost of chronic self-abandonment. Tension settles into the body from constant suppression. Tight shoulders from carrying everyone's problems. Clenched jaw from swallowing words that need to be said. Headaches from the stress of managing everyone's emotions. The body holds what the mind won't acknowledge. The tension becomes so familiar they don't notice it anymore. It's just how their body feels. Illnesses often appear when they finally slow down. The vacation where they get sick. The weekend off where they collapse. The moment they stop moving and the immune system crashes. Their body was holding it together through sheer will, and the second they relax, everything catches up. They wonder why they always get sick when they rest. Don't realize that rest reveals what constant motion was masking. Another pattern is autoimmune conditions, the body attacking itself. This is not metaphor. For some people who chronically abandon themselves, who suppress and override and deny their own needs systematically, the body eventually turns its defenses inward. The symbolism is almost too obvious. They've been attacking themselves psychologically for years. The body manifests what was already happening internally. How they ignore physical symptoms to keep helping others shows the depth of the pattern. They're in pain, but they show up anyway. They're exhausted, but they answer the call. They're sick, but they minimize it because someone else needs them. The body's signals get overridden the same way emotional signals do. They've learned to dismiss physical needs as effectively as they dismiss emotional ones. The pushing through pain to be there for everyone becomes point of pride. They tell themselves they're strong, resilient, capable. Don't recognize that. Ignoring the body's wisdom is not strength, it's self-harm. The body's trying to tell them something is wrong. They interpret the message as weakness to be overcome rather than information to be heeded. What looks like burnout is often deeper than that. It looks like depression, the flatness, the exhaustion, the inability to feel pleasure. But it's not chemical imbalance. It's the natural result of living for everyone except yourself, of giving from empty cup, of disappearing so completely there's almost nothing left. The nervous system stuck in sympathetic activation cannot rest. They're always alert to others' needs, always scanning for who might need help, always ready to respond. The nervous system doesn't know how to turn off because their role as helper never ends. Even when they're alone, they're thinking about others' problems, planning how to help, worrying about people who may not be worrying about them. Over time, they lose connection to the body's signals entirely. They don't know when they're hungry until they're lightheaded. Don't know when they're tired until they collapse. Don't know when they're in pain until it's severe. The disconnect is so complete they're living almost entirely in their head, managing everyone else's needs, while their body screams messages they cannot hear. The dissociation from physical sensation is protective. If they felt everything they were suppressing, they couldn't function. So the body numbs. They go through life slightly removed from physical experience, present, but not fully in their body. This allows them to keep giving beyond their capacity. It also separates them from themselves. The body cannot be fooled by the mind's rationalizations. It knows when it's being abandoned. and it will keep signaling until someone listens. But listening to the body requires acknowledging needs, and acknowledging needs requires believing that those needs matter, which is exactly what they never learned. People who love others more than themselves operate from a belief system so deeply ingrained it feels like truth. My needs are burden. Other people's needs are more important. Taking care of myself is selfish. Being needed is the same as being loved. Worth must be earned through service. The core belief that drives everything is this: I'm only valuable when I'm useful. When they're helping, supporting, giving, they feel worthwhile. When they're not actively serving someone, they feel purposeless, empty, like they're wasting time or being lazy. Their value is completely tied to what they do for others. Being, just existing, just resting, this has no value in their internal economy. The equation they live by is simple and devastating. Self-care equals selfishness. Anytime they prioritize their own needs, they feel selfish. Taking time for themselves feels indulgent. Spending money on themselves feels wasteful. Saying no to help someone feels cruel. The equation is so automatic they don't question it. Of course, taking care of themselves is selfish. What else could it be? Another belief is that asking for help means weakness. Strong people don't need help. Capable people handle things alone. Needing support is failing, so they never ask. They carry everything themselves. They would rather suffer in silence than risk appearing weak or needy. The belief keeps them isolated even when surrounded by people who would help if they knew. They also hold conviction that others' pain is more real than their own. When someone else is suffering, it's legitimate. It deserves attention, care, response. When they're suffering, they minimize it. Tell themselves it's not that bad. Tell themselves others have it worse. They can always find someone whose situation seems more deserving of care than their own. This belief ensures their own suffering never gets addressed. How they minimize their own pain is automatic. I'm fine. It's nothing. I can handle it. These phrases come out without thought. Even when they're falling apart inside, even when they desperately need help, they default to minimizing. They've said, I'm fine so many times it's become reflex. The truth doesn't even have chance to surface before it's suppressed. The belief that love must be earned, never simply received, shapes every relationship. They don't trust that people care about them for who they are. They believe people care because of what they provide. So they keep providing, terrified that if they stop, people will leave. The love they receive never feels secure because it feels conditional on their usefulness. Another core belief is that without usefulness, they have no value. Strip away the helping, the giving, the supporting, and what's left? They don't know. They fear the answer is nothing. So they keep being useful, keep being needed, keep making themselves indispensable, because to stop would mean confronting the terror that they are fundamentally worthless. How they equate boundaries with cruelty keeps them trapped. Setting boundary feels like being mean. Saying no feels like rejecting someone. Protecting their energy feels like withholding love. The belief that boundaries are unkind makes boundaries impossible, so they remain boundaryless, available to everyone, protected from no one. The belief that their needs are inherently less important than others' needs runs beneath everything. It's not that they consciously decide others matter more. It's that in any calculation of whose needs get met, they automatically rank last. Others first, always. Self last, always. The hierarchy is so established it's invisible. The terror of being too much or needy controls behaviour constantly. They police themselves for any sign they're asking too much, requiring too much, expecting too much. Better to need nothing than risk being too much. Better to give everything than risk being seen as needy. The fear of being burdened is so strong, they make themselves as small as possible. These beliefs feel like truth because they've never been questioned. They've been operating since before the person could think critically about them. And when beliefs run that deep, they don't just affect thoughts. They shape every interaction, every relationship, every choice. People who love others more than themselves don't randomly end up in their relationships. They attract specific types. The takers find them. The emotionally unavailable feel safe with them. The narcissists recognize them immediately. Because they broadcast without meaning to that they will give everything and ask for nothing. The people who cannot or will not reciprocate are drawn to them like magnetism. Someone who loves others more than themselves is perfect partner for someone who loves themselves more than others. The dynamic works. One person gives endlessly, the other receives endlessly. There's no friction because the giver doesn't expect reciprocity. They don't even recognize the imbalance as problem. The pattern of one-sided relationships shows up across all areas of life. Friendships where they're always the one calling, planning, showing up. Romantic relationships where they're doing all the emotional labor. Family dynamics where they're the designated helper who never receives help. Work environments where they take on everyone's tasks. The pattern is consistent. They give, others take. What's interesting is how healthy people often pull away. People who value reciprocity, who expect balanced relationships, sense something wrong. They offer care and it's deflected. They try to give back and it's not accepted. The person who loves others more than themselves won't receive. This makes healthy people uncomfortable. They sense the imbalance and create distance because the relationship doesn't feel right. The people who stay are often those comfortable with the imbalance. People who like having someone who will give without expecting return. People who need emotional support but won't provide it. People who want the benefits of relationship without the responsibility. These people recognize someone who won't demand reciprocity, and they stay. How they make excuses for others' selfishness protects the relationship at cost of their own reality. When friend only calls when they need something, they tell themselves friend is just busy. When partner never asks about their day, they tell themselves partner shows love differently. When family member uses them repeatedly, they tell themselves family is complicated. The excuses prevent them from seeing clearly. Another pattern is being the giver in every friendship. They're the one friends vent to, the one who offers advice, support, encouragement. But when they need support, friends aren't available, or don't know how to help because the dynamic was never reciprocal. The person who loves others more than themselves trained everyone around them that the relationship flows one direction. In romantic relationships, they often end up with emotionally unavailable partners, partners who cannot meet them emotionally, cannot reciprocate care, cannot be vulnerable. These partners feel safe to someone who doesn't expect emotional intimacy. The lack of reciprocity doesn't trigger their abandonment because they don't believe they deserve reciprocity. So they stay in relationships that slowly starve them. The cycle of attracting people who use them repeats until they cannot ignore it anymore. Different people, same dynamic. They meet someone, they give generously. The person takes, they give more, The person takes more. They give everything. The person leaves when they finally express a need. They blame themselves. They try again with someone new. The cycle repeats. How they cannot recognize red flags comes from the self-blame. When someone treats them poorly, they assume they deserved it. When someone takes advantage, they assume they allowed it. When someone uses them, they assume they weren't clear enough. They look inward for fault rather than recognizing the other person's behavior as the problem. The loneliness of being surrounded by people but feeling unseen is a particular kind of isolation. They have full life, many relationships, constant social contact, but no one really sees them. No one knows what they need because they never show it. No one asks because they always seem fine. The isolation exists in the middle of connection because the connection is all surface. They don't consciously choose people who will use them, but their inability to advocate for themselves, to expect reciprocity, to believe they deserve care. This creates a filter. Healthy people sense the imbalance and leave. Unhealthy people sense the opportunity and stay. And in these imbalanced relationships, a particular kind of exhaustion develops, not just tiredness, something deeper. The exhaustion that comes from loving others more than yourself is not the kind that sleep fixes. It is not the tiredness of doing too much. It is the tiredness of being too little, of making yourself smaller and smaller until you're not sure there's anything left. The depletion that comes from constant self-suppression is different from physical fatigue. They can rest their body, can take vacation, can sleep 8 hours, and still wake up exhausted, because the exhaustion is not in the muscles, it's in the soul. It comes from years of saying yes when they meant no, of being there for everyone while no one is there for them, of giving from empty cup until the cup itself begins to crack. They feel empty rather than just tired. There's hollowness inside that has nothing to do with physical energy. They go through the motions, they function, they show up. But inside there's vast emptiness. Like they've given away so many pieces of themselves, there's almost nothing left. The emptiness doesn't respond to rest because rest doesn't restore what's been lost. The loss of vitality shows in subtle ways. Things that used to bring joy feel flat. Activities they once loved feel like obligations. Connections that used to energize them feel draining. The spark inside them, the life force, has been dampened by years of neglecting it. They don't feel fully alive. They feel like they're going through motions of living without actually inhabiting their life. How rest doesn't restore them becomes confusing. They're tired, so they rest. They wake up still tired. They take a day off and feel the same. They go on vacation and return exhausted. Nothing helps because the problem isn't physical depletion, it's spiritual bankruptcy. They've been withdrawing from themselves for so long there's almost nothing left to restore. The exhaustion of pretending to be fine takes enormous energy. Every interaction requires performance. They have to seem okay even when they're falling apart, have to seem capable even when they're overwhelmed, have to seem happy even when they're empty. The performance is constant, it never ends, and maintaining it drains whatever reserves they have left. Another layer is the weight of holding everyone else's emotions. They absorb others' stress, pain, anxiety, grief. They take it in, try to process it, carry it for the other person. Over time, they're carrying not just their own emotional weight, but the weight of everyone around them. The accumulated burden becomes crushing. How they feel invisible even in crowded rooms captures the loneliness perfectly. They're surrounded by people, engaged in conversations, part of community, but they feel completely unseen, because no one sees the real them, the struggling them, the tired them, the depleted them. Everyone sees the performance, the helpful, capable, fine version. The real self is invisible. The tiredness of having no one to be real with creates different kind of exhaustion. They cannot let their guard down anywhere, cannot drop the performance, cannot be messy or needy or struggling. Not because people wouldn't accept it, but because they cannot show it. So they're always on, always composed, always okay. The lack of anywhere to simply be without performing is exhausting. Another aspect is the exhaustion of never being able to let down their guard. Vigilance requires energy. Being constantly aware of others' needs, constantly managing their own presentation, constantly calculating how to be helpful without being burden. The mental energy this requires is enormous, and it never stops. The chronic feeling of running on empty becomes normal. They don't remember what full feels like, don't remember having reserves. They've been running on fumes for so long that empty is their baseline. They function anyway because they have to, because people need them, but they're running on nothing. This is not tiredness, this is disappearance. The exhaustion is their system's way of saying that something unsustainable is happening. That giving from an empty cup doesn't just fail to fill others, it empties the giver entirely. And when they're that depleted, something else emerges, something they've worked hard to avoid their entire lives. Underneath the patience, underneath the understanding, underneath the endless giving, there is often rage, quiet, suppressed, sometimes completely unconscious. But it's there, building with every unreciprocated gesture, every ignored need, every time they showed up and no one showed up for them. The resentment they cannot acknowledge without feeling like a bad person is toxic. They feel it. The anger, the bitterness, the sense of being used. But acknowledging it would make them a bad person in their own eyes. Good people don't resent helping others. Good people give freely without keeping score. So they push the resentment down, deny it exists, feel guilty for feeling it. How the anger leaks out in passive-aggressive ways reveals what they won't acknowledge directly. Little comments that have edge, saying yes, but with tone that suggests no, doing what was asked, but with resentment that shows in body language. The anger finds ways out because suppressed emotion always does, but it comes out sideways because direct expression feels impossible. The guilt about feeling resentful when they chose to help compounds everything. They volunteered, they offered, they said yes. So how can they be angry? The fact that yes never felt like choice, that they couldn't say no without overwhelming guilt, that the choice was coerced by their own conditioning. This doesn't register. They said yes. Therefore they have no right to feel used. The logic traps them. How they turn the anger inward is particularly destructive. If they can't be angry at others for taking, they get angry at themselves for giving. They blame themselves for being weak, for being a doormat, for not standing up for themselves. The anger that should be directed at people who use them gets directed at themselves instead. This creates shame on top of resentment. The belief that resentment means they're selfish keeps the anger suppressed. Only selfish people keep score. Only selfish people feel resentful about helping. Only selfish people get angry when others need them. So feeling resentment becomes more evidence of their fundamental badness. The resentment itself makes them feel guilty, which suppresses it further, which builds more resentment. Another painful aspect is how they apologize for their anger, while others never apologize for taking. The rare times they express frustration, they apologize immediately, profusely. They're so sorry for being difficult, for complaining, for not being understanding. Meanwhile, the people who take endlessly never apologize, never acknowledge the imbalance, never express gratitude. The apology only goes one direction. The explosions that sometimes happen after years of suppression are frightening. All the accumulated resentment erupts. They snap over something small. The rage that's been building for years comes out in disproportionate response. They're shocked by their own intensity, ashamed of losing control. The explosion confirms their worst belief about themselves, that underneath they're bad, angry, selfish. How the explosions confirm they're bad, for feeling anger completes the cycle. The explosion happens. They're horrified. They see themselves as the problem. They apologize excessively. They commit to being more patient, more understanding, more giving. They suppress even harder. The pressure builds again. The cycle repeats. The pattern runs like this. Give without reciprocity. Feel used. Feel guilty for feeling used. Give more to prove they're not resentful. Build more resentment. Suppress harder. Eventually explode or implode. Feel terrible about the anger. Give more to compensate. The cycle feeds itself. Each iteration makes the resentment deeper and the suppression stronger. The exhaustion of managing both the giving and the anger about it doubles the depletion. They're giving to everyone else, and they're managing their own resentment about the giving. They're doing emotional labor for others and for themselves. The energy required is enormous, and they have no outlet for any of it. The resentment is information they cannot hear. The resentment isn't proof they're selfish, it's proof they're human. It's the part of them that knows this isn't fair, that something is wrong, that they deserve better. But they've learned to silence that knowing voice as effectively as they silence everything else about themselves. Silencing that voice requires enormous energy. It requires convincing themselves daily that this is just who they are, that this is fine, that they're okay. For people who love others more than themselves, being the helper isn't just what they do, it's who they are. Strip away the giving, the supporting, the accommodating, and they don't know what's left. Their identity is built on a foundation of self-erasure. How they define themselves through relationships to others shows in their language. Ask them who they are and they describe themselves in relational terms. I'm a good friend, I'm a supportive partner, I'm the person people come to, I'm someone who helps. Their identity exists entirely in reference to others. They have no sense of self that stands independent. The terror of not being needed is existential. If no one needs them, who are they? What's their purpose? How do they matter? The questions are so threatening they avoid situations where they might not be needed. They seek out people with problems. They offer help before it's requested. They make themselves indispensable because indispensable feels like insurance against the void. What happens when they're not useful reveals the fragility of the identity. Someone says, I don't need anything, I'm good. They feel lost, purposeless, like they failed at the one thing they're supposed to do. The absence of need to meet creates absence of self. They don't know how to be in a relationship that doesn't require them to give. How they have no sense of self outside of helping role becomes clear in crisis. When illness prevents them from helping, when someone they care for no longer needs them, when they're forced to stop being useful, They face terrifying emptiness. They don't know who they are if they're not helping, have no hobbies, no interests, no desires that exist separately from their role. The emptiness when someone doesn't need them anymore is profound. A friend becomes self-sufficient. A partner becomes emotionally healthy. A family member solves their own problems. This should be good news. Instead, it feels like loss, like they're no longer necessary, like the relationship has no purpose if there's no need for them to meet. Over time, they seek out people who need help to feel purposeful. This isn't conscious, but they're drawn to people with problems, people who are struggling, people who need support. These relationships make them feel valuable, make them feel like they matter. They don't realize they're selecting for neediness because neediness validates their worth. The addiction to being needed is real. The feeling of being necessary, of being important to someone, of being the person someone relies on. This creates neurochemical response. It feels good. It feels like love. They chase that feeling by making themselves more and more needed. The addiction drives the pattern deeper. How they've never developed identity separate from service becomes obvious when they try. They don't know what they like if it's not tied to being helpful. Don't know what brings them joy if it doesn't involve supporting someone. Don't have interests that exist purely for their own enjoyment. Their entire life is oriented around service to others. The fear that without usefulness they're nothing drives compulsive giving. If they stop being helpful, they believe they'll be abandoned, rejected, alone. So they keep giving even when exhausted, keep helping even when depleted, keep being useful because useful feels like their only value. The crisis that comes when they can no longer help, through illness, aging, change in circumstance, forces confrontation with the emptiness. When the role is taken away, what's left? They discover they don't know, haven't developed anything else, haven't built any other foundation. The identity built on service collapses when service is no longer possible. Identity built on self-abandonment is inherently unstable. It requires constant external validation to exist. When no one needs them, they face terrifying question: who am I? That question is so threatening that most people who love others more than themselves never let it surface. They stay busy. They stay needed. They stay in motion. Focusing on others isn't just natural inclination for people who love others more than themselves. It's strategic avoidance. As long as they're managing someone else's emotions, solving someone else's problems, caring for someone else's needs, they don't have to face their own inner emptiness. How helping others is escape from self becomes clear when they're alone. The moment there's no one to help, no one to support, no problem to solve, they feel uncomfortable, anxious, like they should be doing something. Being alone with themselves feels threatening in ways they don't consciously recognize. So they find someone who needs them, find something to fix, stay in motion. The fear of being alone with own thoughts and feelings drives constant activity. If they slow down, if they get quiet, things emerge. Feelings they've been suppressing, needs they've been denying, grief they've been avoiding. The emergence is so uncomfortable they'll do anything to prevent it, including exhausting themselves in service of everyone else. What they're avoiding is varied and painful. Grief for what they never received, anger at being used, sadness about their own life, longing for things they've never allowed themselves to want, fear about the future. All of it sits below the surface, waiting. As long as they stay focused externally, they don't have to feel it. How busyness with others prevents self-reflection is precisely the point. Self-reflection would require confronting uncomfortable truths, that they're depleted, that relationships are unbalanced, that they're angry, that they have needs, that something is deeply wrong. Staying busy with others' concerns keeps these truths from surfacing. The terror of silence and stillness is real. Meditation feels impossible. Sitting quietly creates panic. Being alone for extended period feels intolerable. The silence allows what's been suppressed to emerge. So they fill every moment with people, with tasks, with others' needs, anything to avoid silence. What happens when they're forced to stop helping shows what the activity was masking. Illness that requires rest. Circumstances that remove the option to help. Suddenly they're alone with themselves, and they discover vast pain they didn't know was there. The grief crashes in, the anger surfaces, the emptiness becomes undeniable. The void they discover when external focus is removed is terrifying. They've been running from this void their entire life. They built entire identity to avoid it, and now, with nowhere to run, they face it. The emptiness isn't new. It's been there all along. They've just been successfully avoiding it until now. How they've used others' needs to avoid their own pain is the function the pattern serves. Others' problems are easier to deal with than their own. Others' emotions are easier to manage than their own. Others' needs are easier to meet than acknowledging they have needs. The pattern is a elaborate avoidance system. The panic that arises when there's nothing to do for anyone reveals the dependency. They need to be needed, need to have purpose through helping. When that's removed, they don't know how to be, don't know how to occupy themselves, don't know how to exist without the role. How the pattern is both service and escape shows its dual function. Yes, they genuinely care about others. Yes, they want to help. And also, yes, helping keeps them from themselves. Both are true. The caring is real. The avoidance is also real. They don't cancel each other out. The giving is also hiding. The pattern of loving others more than themselves serves dual purpose. It makes them feel valuable, and it keeps them from encountering the parts of themselves they've been taught to ignore. But avoidance has limits. Eventually, what's been ignored starts demanding attention, not through thoughts, but through crisis. The pattern of loving others more than yourself can run for years, even decades, and then something happens. An illness that cannot be ignored, a betrayal that cannot be rationalized, a collapse that cannot be hidden. The system that held everything together fails. The various forms crisis takes are different, but the function is the same. Physical breakdown where body simply cannot continue. Emotional collapse where nervous system shuts down. Relationship betrayal where someone they've given everything to abandons them. The crisis interrupts what was unsustainable. Forces a stop they couldn't choose voluntarily. How crisis forces them to stop giving is sometimes the only thing that can. They get seriously ill. They cannot get out of bed. They cannot help anyone. For the first time, they're forced to receive care instead of give it. The role reversal is deeply uncomfortable, but it's also unavoidable. The terror of not being able to help anyone when they're in crisis is acute. They feel useless. They feel like burden. They watch people need things and cannot respond. The inability to perform their role creates existential anxiety. Who are they if they cannot help? The question they've avoided surfaces with force. What happens when they're the one who needs care reveals much about their relationships. Some people step up beautifully, show care they didn't know existed, meet their needs with generosity. These people surprise them. They didn't know reciprocity was possible, didn't know people could give to them the way they give to others, but others disappear. Friends who called constantly when they needed support vanish when the support needs to flow the other direction. Partners who appreciated their endless giving become resentful when they need anything. Family members who relied on them become impatient with their inability to help. The disappearance is devastating but also clarifying. The difficulty of receiving when identity is built on giving is profound. They don't know how to receive care, don't know how to ask for help, don't know how to be vulnerable. Even in crisis, they try to minimize their needs, try to be easy, try to recover quickly so they can return to their role. Receiving feels more painful than the crisis itself. How crisis reveals who actually cares about them is the gift hidden in the devastation. They discover which relationships were transactional, which people only stayed because of what they provided, which connections can hold them being needy instead of helpful. The revelation hurts, but it's also truth they needed. The people who disappear when they can't give anymore show what the relationship actually was. These people didn't love them. These people loved what they provided. When the provision stops, the person leaves. The loss confirms their worst fear, that they're only valuable when useful. But it also reveals that those relationships were never genuine. The grief of discovering relationships were one-sided is enormous. They gave everything. They believed these people cared. They thought the relationships were mutual. Crisis reveals the truth. They were being used. The relationships were conditional. The care only flowed one direction. The grief is for what they thought they had, and for the years spent giving to people who never actually cared. The forced confrontation with self-abandonment cannot be avoided in crisis. They can see clearly, finally, how they've treated themselves, how little they've valued their own needs, how completely they've erased themselves. The pattern is undeniable when they're forced to stop performing it. Another dimension is the opportunity hidden in breakdown. Crisis destroys what was unsustainable, creates opening for something different. They're devastated, and also they're finally stopped, finally forced to face themselves, finally unable to avoid the truth. The crisis is both destruction and possibility. The pattern breaks. Crisis is cruel teacher, but sometimes it's the only thing that can interrupt a pattern this deeply ingrained. When they cannot physically continue giving, they're finally forced to face what they've been avoiding. And in that forced stillness, in that unwanted pause, recognition begins. Not comfortable recognition, not welcome awareness, but truth nonetheless. Recognition doesn't come as relief, it comes as grief. The moment someone realizes they've spent their entire life loving others more than themselves, the weight of all those abandoned needs, all those suppressed truths, all those years of self-erasure crashes down at once. The painful clarity that arrives is visceral, not intellectual understanding, body-level knowing. They feel suddenly the accumulation of years, feel every time they said yes when they meant no, every time they suppressed their needs, every time they made themselves smaller. The feeling is overwhelming. Seeing the pattern across all relationships is disorienting. They look back and see it everywhere. Every friendship, every romance, every family dynamic, every work relationship. The same pattern. Different people. Same dynamic. They were always the giver, always the one accommodating, always the one who loved others more than themselves. The consistency is undeniable and devastating. The grief for time lost for self-abandoned is profound. They grieve the years spent disappearing. grieve the version of themselves that might have existed if they'd been taught differently, grieve the relationships that might have been mutual if they'd valued themselves. The grief is not for one thing, it's for everything. For entire life lived in service of everyone except themselves. Another layer is the anger that arrives with recognition. Anger at being taught this. Anger at parents who conditioned them. Anger at culture that praised their self-sacrifice. Anger at people who took advantage. Anger at themselves for participating. The anger is hot and frightening because they've suppressed it so long. The recognition that it wasn't virtue, it was conditioning, shifts everything. They thought they were a good person, thought their selflessness was moral superiority. Recognition reveals it was survival strategy from childhood, was wound, not virtue, was conditioning, not character. The reframe is both devastating and liberating. Understanding how they participated in their own erasure is painful. They cannot entirely blame others. They said yes. They gave endlessly. They never asked for reciprocity. They taught people how to treat them. The recognition of their own participation makes the pattern harder to frame as something done to them. They were victim and participant both. The compassion that can emerge for a younger self is healing when it comes. Seeing the child who learned this pattern, understanding they were doing their best, recognizing the impossible situation they were in, the compassion allows them to hold both truths. They participated in their own abandonment, and they were conditioned to do so. The terror of changing when pattern feels like identity is existential. If they're not the helpful one, who are they? If they start saying no, start setting boundaries, start prioritizing themselves, they become someone they don't recognize, someone who might be selfish, someone who might be bad. The fear of becoming a different person is almost strong enough to prevent change. The loneliness of seeing what others still don't see isolates them further. They recognize the pattern. They see the imbalance. They understand what's been happening. But people around them don't. Friends still expect them to be endlessly available. Partners still expect them to accommodate everything. Family still expects them to be the helper. They're awake to something others can't see. The beginning of questioning everything follows recognition. If this fundamental belief about themselves is wrong, what else is wrong? They start examining everything. Their relationships, their choices, their life. The questioning is exhausting but necessary. They're rebuilding from foundation up. Recognition is not the beginning of easy change. It's the beginning of difficult truth. But truth, even painful truth, is more solid ground than the lies they've been standing on. With recognition comes choice. Not easy choice, not clear choice, but choice. Nonetheless, the choice to continue the pattern consciously or to begin the painful work of changing it. After recognition comes a moment of decision. Not a single dramatic choice, but a series of small daily decisions. To keep doing what's familiar or to try something terrifyingly different. To keep loving others more than themselves, or to begin the uncomfortable work of including themselves in the circle of their own care. Why some people see the pattern and keep doing it anyway reveals the depth of the fear. Change feels more frightening than continuation. Familiar pain feels safer than unfamiliar uncertainty. So they see clearly what they're doing. They understand it's harming them, and they keep doing it because they don't know how to be any other way. The terror of change when identity is at stake cannot be overstated. They are the helper, the giver, the selfless one. Changing this means changing who they fundamentally are, or who they believe they are. The identity feels like self, so changing the pattern feels like self-destruction, like becoming someone else, someone they might not recognize or like. The guilt that arises with every self-focused choice is immediate and intense. They say no to a request. They feel guilty. They prioritize their own need. They feel selfish. They set a boundary. They feel cruel. The guilt is so powerful it almost reverses the decision, almost pulls them back into the familiar pattern. How change feels like becoming someone they don't recognize is disorienting. They look at themselves making self-focused choices and don't know this person who has boundaries, who says no, who prioritizes their own needs. This person seems foreign, seems wrong, seems not them. The resistance from others when they start changing is predictable but still painful. People who benefited from their boundary-lessness resist the boundaries. Friends who relied on endless availability become upset when they're not available. Partners who appreciated their flexibility resent their newfound firmness. The resistance confirms their fear that change will cost them relationships. The loneliness of choosing self when everyone expects otherwise is acute. They're making different choices, prioritizing themselves, setting boundaries, and everyone around them is confused, upset, or angry. They feel alone in the decision, like they're doing something wrong, like they're betraying who they're supposed to be. The small acts of change feel monumental. Saying no to one request, asking for help once, prioritizing their own need over someone else's want. These tiny choices feel enormous because they violate lifelong conditioning. Each one requires conscious decision against every instinct. How each choice for self feels like betrayal is the emotional reality. They're betraying the child who learned to be helpful, betraying the role they've performed, betraying others' expectations, betraying who they thought they were. Even when the change is healthy, it feels like betrayal. The constant pull back toward familiar pattern is relentless. They make change. Then something happens and the old pattern calls to them. Someone needs them. The pull to give, to help, to sacrifice is so strong. Resisting it takes enormous effort. Often they don't resist. They slip back into the pattern because it's easier than fighting it. The need for support during transition is critical. They cannot do this alone, cannot change patterns this deep without help. They need therapy, friends who support the change, people who can witness and encourage. Without support, the pull of the pattern and the resistance from others will overwhelm the fragile new choices. Change means loss. The decision to change isn't made once, it's made hundreds of times. Each time the old pattern pulls them back towards self-abandonment, and they choose differently, even just slightly differently, they're making the decision again. And with each small choice for self, they begin learning what they were never taught. How to care for themselves with the same dedication they've shown everyone else. For people who've loved others more than themselves their entire lives, self-care is not intuitive. It's not something they can just start doing. It's a foreign language they have to learn word by word, stumbling over pronunciation, making countless mistakes, feeling foolish the entire time. How they don't even know what they need is the first obstacle. Ask them what would help, and they draw blank. They've spent so long ignoring their own needs they cannot identify them anymore. Don't know if they're hungry, tired, overwhelmed, sad. The signals are there, but they cannot read them. The process of learning to identify own feelings wants, needs, requires conscious attention. They have to stop and ask themselves questions that should be automatic. What am I feeling right now? What do I need? What would help? The questions feel awkward, unnatural, like they're doing something wrong by asking them. How rest feels uncomfortable, wrong, undeserved, shows depth of conditioning. They take a day off and feel guilty the entire time. They rest and feel like they're wasting time. They relax and feel like they should be doing something productive. Rest doesn't restore them because they cannot allow themselves to actually rest. The guilt that accompanies every act of self-care is crushing. They take a bath and feel selfish. They buy something for themselves and feel wasteful. They spend time on a hobby and feel like they should be helping someone. Every single act of self-care triggers guilt. Learning to say no without extensive justification is incredibly difficult. They want to say no, but cannot just say it. They have to explain, have to justify, have to prove they have good reason. The idea of no as complete sentence feels impossible, feels rude, feels like they owe explanation for not being available. The discomfort of putting themselves first is physical. They make choice that prioritizes their need. Their body responds with tension, guilt, anxiety. The discomfort is so intense they often reverse the decision just to make the feeling stop. Putting themselves first feels wrong at cellular level. How they have to consciously practice what comes naturally to others is humbling. Other people seem to advocate for themselves easily, seem to know their needs, seem to prioritize themselves without agonizing. For them, every act of self-care is conscious practice against instinct. The resistance that arises from within is stronger than an external resistance. They fight themselves constantly. They want to change, and they fight every step of change. The internal sabotage is relentless. The voice that says they're being selfish, that they should be helping others, that they're doing it wrong. Another painful aspect is the people who criticize their self-care as selfishness. Family members who call them selfish for setting boundaries. Friends who accuse them of changing in bad way. Partners who resent that they're not as available. The external criticism confirms their worst fears about themselves. The slow building of capacity to prioritize self happens through repetition. They practice, they fail, they feel guilty, they try again. Each attempt builds a tiny bit of capacity. Over months and years, self-prioritization becomes slightly less foreign. Still not natural, but possible. It feels wrong to care for themselves. Learning to love themselves even a fraction as much as they love others requires unlearning decades of conditioning. It's not a skill picked up quickly. It's a practice that must be repeated until it becomes less foreign, less wrong, less impossible. But practice alone isn't enough. They also need to understand what drives the pattern deeper than behavior. They need to address the beliefs. The beliefs that drive loving others more than yourself are so deeply embedded, they don't feel like beliefs. They feel like facts, like truth, like the way the world works. Challenging them feels like questioning reality itself. The specific beliefs that must be questioned are foundational. My needs don't matter. I'm only valuable when useful. Self-care is selfish. Asking for help is weakness. Others' pain is more real than mine. These beliefs run so deep they're almost unconscious. Bringing them to conscious awareness is the first step. How to recognize belief versus truth requires examining evidence. A belief feels absolutely true, but when examined, it's just story they've been telling themselves. They believe their needs don't matter. But is that true? Or is it what they learned? The distinction between truth and belief becomes crucial. The evidence they gather against their beliefs comes slowly. They ask for help, and person responds with care. Evidence against asking for help pushes people away. They prioritize their own need, and relationship survives. Evidence against self-care is selfish. Each piece of counter-evidence weakens the belief slightly. Learning that needs are not burden happens through experience. They express need. Instead of rejection, they receive care. They ask for support. Instead of abandonment, they receive help. The experience contradicts the belief. Over time, with enough contradictory experiences, the belief begins to loosen. Understanding that self-care is not selfish requires redefining both terms. Self-care is not indulgence, it's maintenance. Like fueling a car. The car can't run without fuel. They can't function without care. Framing self-care as necessary rather than indulgent helps challenge the belief. Recognizing that their worth isn't conditional on usefulness is the deepest work. They have worth simply by existing. Their value doesn't come from what they do. It comes from being human. This sounds simple. For them, it's revolutionary and hard to believe. The grief of realizing they believed lies about themselves is profound. They've spent entire life operating from false beliefs. Beliefs that harmed them, beliefs that kept them small. Realizing these were lies, that they didn't have to believe them, that they could have lived differently. The grief is overwhelming. How others may have benefited from these beliefs is painful to acknowledge. Parents who needed them to be easy, partners who needed them to be accommodating, friends who needed them to be endlessly available. These people, consciously or not, benefited from the beliefs, may have reinforced them, may resist when beliefs change. The resistance from people invested in the old beliefs is often intense. People who liked them boundaryless don't like boundaries. People who like them endlessly giving don't like when they stop. The resistance can be subtle or overt, but it's there. Building new beliefs slowly through experience is the only way that works. They cannot think their way into new beliefs, cannot force themselves to believe differently. They need experiences that contradict old beliefs and support new ones. Need to live into new beliefs before they feel true. Beliefs can be changed. Beliefs formed in childhood carry enormous power because they were accepted before critical thinking developed. But beliefs, even ancient ones, can be examined, can be questioned, can be slowly, painfully replaced with beliefs that allow them to exist in the world without disappearing. New beliefs need support to take root. They cannot grow in the same soil as the old pattern, which means relationships must change. When people who've loved others more than themselves begin to change, their relationships undergo seismic shifts. Some people support the change, many don't. Some relationships deepen, many end. The entire social ecosystem that was built on their self-abandonment must reorganize or dissolve. How setting boundaries reveals who actually cares about them is brutal clarity. They set boundary. Some people respect it. These people actually care about them, not just what they provide. Other people violate it, resist it, punish them for it. These people care about what they get, not about the person. The people who leave when they stop giving excessively show what the relationship was. These relationships were transactional, conditional on their endless giving. When the giving stops, the person leaves. The loss hurts, but it also reveals truth. These people never actually loved them. The grief of losing relationships that felt important is real. These relationships mattered to them. They invested years. They cared deeply. Losing them feels like failure, like they did something wrong. The grief needs to be honoured even as they recognise the relationships were unhealthy. The relief of discovering who stays is profound. Some people celebrate their growth, support their boundaries, love them more as they become more themselves. These people were there for them, not for what they could get. These relationships can now deepen because they're finally mutual. How they attract different people as they change is noticeable. When they valued themselves, people who value them appear. When they had boundaries, people who respect boundaries show up. When they stopped accepting crumbs, people capable of genuine care enter their life. The change in who they attract reflects the change in how they relate to themselves. The difficulty of maintaining boundaries with those who resist is an ongoing challenge. Family members who don't respect boundaries, old friends who want the old dynamic, partners who resist the change. Maintaining boundaries with people who resist requires constant effort, constant recommitment to self. Learning reciprocity in relationships feels foreign at first. Someone gives to them. They receive without immediately giving back. It feels uncomfortable. They have to practice just receiving. Practice letting relationships be mutual. Practice expecting that care should flow both directions. The small circle that remains versus the large circle that existed shows the difference between quantity and quality. They had many relationships. Most were one-sided. Now they have fewer relationships, but these are genuine. The circle is smaller, but the connections are real. How quality replaces quantity is the shift. They no longer need many people. They need real people. People who show up for them as they show up for others. The smaller circle provides more actual support than the larger circle ever did. The loneliness and liberation of changed relationships coexist. They're lonely because they lost people who mattered to them. They're liberated because they're no longer giving to people who don't reciprocate. Both feelings are real. Both need to be held. Some people only loved who they could use. Relationship change is one of the hardest parts of learning to love themselves. But relationships built on their self-erasure were never truly loving them. Losing those relationships makes room for connections that can hold all of who they are. As relationships shift, so does their internal landscape. The part of them that feared being alone discovers something unexpected. For people who've spent their lives focused on others, being alone with themselves is terrifying. When the noise of others' needs finally quiets, they discover they don't know who they are. The person they meet in solitude is a stranger. The discomfort of solitude when they've always avoided it is intense. Being alone means being with themselves, with their thoughts, with their feelings, with everything they've been avoiding. The discomfort almost drives them back to filling time with others' needs. Almost, but they stay. They sit with the discomfort. What emerges in silence is everything they've suppressed. Grief surfaces, anger rises, needs become clear, wants emerge. All the feelings that were pushed down, ignored, suppressed, they come up when there's finally space for them. The emergence is overwhelming but also necessary. The stranger they discover is themselves. They meet parts of themselves that have been hidden, parts that are angry, parts that are sad, parts that have needs, parts that have wants. These parts feel foreign because they've been exiled so long, but they're not stranger, they're self, finally allowed to exist. How they've been absent from their own life becomes painfully clear. They've been so focused on others they weren't present for themselves, weren't there for their own experiences, weren't inhabiting their own life. They were too busy managing everyone else's life to live their own. The preferences they didn't know they had start to emerge. They discover they actually like certain things, dislike other things, have opinions that aren't borrowed from whoever they're with. The preferences are small at first, favourite colour, preferred food, but they're theirs, genuinely theirs. The interests that were buried under others' priorities begin to surface, things they wanted to try but never did because they were busy helping everyone else. Creative pursuits, physical activities, learning interests. They start exploring what actually interests them, not what interests the people in their life. The voice that was silent so long it's barely a whisper starts to get stronger. Their own voice, the one that knows what they need, the one that has opinions, the one that can say what's true for them. At first it's so quiet they can barely hear it, but with attention, it gets louder. Learning to be with themselves without judgment is the practice. They sit alone. Thoughts come. Feelings come. Instead of immediately criticizing themselves, they try to just observe, just be with themselves. The practice is difficult. The habit of self-judgment is strong. But they keep trying. The loneliness that was there all along, finally felt, is different from the loneliness of isolation. They've been lonely for years, surrounded by people but feeling alone. Now they feel the loneliness directly. It's painful, but it's also honest. They're not performing anymore, not pretending, just feeling what's actually there. The beginning of a relationship with self is tentative. They start talking to themselves with kindness, start checking in with themselves, start asking what they need. It feels strange, self-conscious, but they keep doing it. Keep building relationship with the self they abandoned. They begin to come home to themselves. Solitude, which they avoided their entire lives, becomes the space where they finally hear themselves, where the quiet voice that was drowned out by everyone else's needs can finally speak. And as they learn to hear that voice, to trust it, to honour it, something shifts in how they move through the world. Boundaries, for people who loved others more than themselves, feel like walls, like cruelty, like selfishness. The idea that they could say no, that they could protect their energy, that they could prioritize their own needs, this feels fundamentally wrong. What boundaries actually are versus what they fear they are requires education. Boundaries aren't walls that keep people out. Boundaries are clear limits about what they can give and what they need. Boundaries aren't rejection. They're honest communication about capacity. This understanding helps, but the guilt remains. The guilt of the first boundary set is enormous. They say no. They feel terrible. They set limit. They feel cruel. They protect their energy. They feel selfish. The guilt is almost unbearable. It makes them want to reverse the boundary immediately. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they hold it despite the guilt. How others react to their boundaries with anger or manipulation is predictable. People who benefited from boundarylessness don't like boundaries. They get angry. They guilt trip. They accuse of selfishness. They manipulate. The reaction confirms every fear, makes it harder to maintain the boundary. Learning that boundaries don't mean not caring is crucial distinction. They can care about someone and still have boundaries with them, can love someone and still say no, can want to help and still protect their own energy. Boundaries don't eliminate care, they make care sustainable. The practice of no, without extensive justification is ongoing work. They want to explain, want to justify, want to prove they have good reason. Learning that no is complete sentence feels revolutionary, feels rude, but they practice anyway. No, I can't. No, that doesn't work for me. No, just no. How boundaries protect relationships rather than harm them is counterintuitive but true. When they give beyond capacity, resentment builds. When they have boundaries, they can give from genuine desire rather than obligation. The relationships that survive boundaries become healthier because both people can be honest. The people who respect boundaries versus those who don't divides their relationships cleanly. Some people hear no and respect it. These people care about them. Other people hear no and push, manipulate, punish. These people care about getting what they want. The division is clarifying. Learning their limits and honouring them requires constant attention. They have to know how much capacity they have to be honest about their limits, have to honour those limits even when it disappoints someone. The honouring is the practice. The energy that returns when boundaries exist is noticeable. They're not giving beyond capacity, not depleting themselves, not overriding their limits. They have energy they haven't had in years, energy for themselves, energy for the things they actually want to do. The slow building of boundary tolerance happens through repetition. First boundary feels impossible. Second boundary feels terrible. 10th boundary feels difficult. 100th boundary feels possible. 1000th boundary feels normal. The tolerance builds through practice. Boundaries are love. Boundaries don't make them selfish. Boundaries make them sustainable. They protect not just themselves, but the genuine care they can offer when it's not coming from depletion. With boundaries in place, something unexpected happens. They discover they can actually be more present, more genuinely helpful when they're not depleted. There is a difference between giving from overflow and giving from deficit. Between caring for others because you want to and caring for others because you believe you have to. Between generous support and self-abandonment disguised as love. How they learn to give from choice, not obligation, changes the quality of giving. When they give because they choose to, because they want to, because they have capacity, it feels different, lighter, free. When they give from obligation, from should, from have to, it feels heavy, resentful, draining. The difference is everything. The difference in energy when giving comes from fullness is profound. They're not depleted. They have energy to give. They offer help and it doesn't drain them. They support someone and still have energy left for themselves. The giving feels generous rather than desperate. How they can actually be more helpful when not depleted is counterintuitive to them. They thought they had to give everything to help, but when they give everything, they have nothing left. When they give from fullness, they can sustain it, can be consistently present, can offer genuine support over time. Learning to give without expecting nothing in return versus requiring reciprocity is nuanced shift. They're not keeping score, not demanding equal exchange, but they're also not accepting completely one-sided relationships. They give freely when they choose to, and they notice if care ever flows back. The noticing protects them. The joy that can exist in giving when it's not compulsive is new feeling. Giving can feel good, can feel generous, can feel like genuine expression of care. When it's not coming from compulsion, from need to be needed, from fear of rejection, it can be joyful. They discover they actually like helping people when it's choice. How they choose who receives their care and energy develops discernment. They don't give to everyone equally anymore, don't respond to every request. They choose, based on relationship, based on capacity, based on whether care is reciprocal. The choosing protects their energy for people and things that actually matter. The discernment that develops is learned skill. They learn to recognize who deserves their energy, who respects their boundaries, who reciprocates care, who actually values them. The discernment allows them to direct care wisely rather than scatter it everywhere. How sustainable giving includes self is the crucial shift. When they calculate capacity for giving, they include themselves in the calculation. They can give this much and still have energy for themselves. They can help here and still meet their own needs. Including self in the equation changes everything. The balance they never knew was possible becomes real. They can care for others and care for themselves, can be generous and have boundaries, can help and still have energy. The balance seemed impossible. Now it's their life. The peace of giving freely rather than desperately is profound. No resentment, no depletion, no guilt. Just genuine care offered from genuine desire. The peace this brings is deeper than they've known. They can give and remain. Learning to include themselves in their own circle of care doesn't make them less giving. It makes their giving sustainable. It means they can offer care for a lifetime rather than burning out in years. But even with all this work, all this awareness, all this change, the old pattern will still call to them. The pattern of loving others more than yourself doesn't vanish completely. The neural pathways carved in childhood, the beliefs formed before language, the identity built over decades, these don't simply dissolve, but they can become less controlling, less automatic, less total. How the pattern will resurface under stress is guaranteed. When life becomes overwhelming, when they're scared, when they're uncertain, the old pattern activates. Someone needs them, and they immediately want to give everything, want to abandon themselves, want to fall back into familiar role. The pull is strong. Learning to recognize it faster when it emerges is the growth. Before, the pattern would run for weeks before they noticed. Now they notice within days, sometimes within hours. The recognition gets faster. The awareness creates possibility for choice. The practice of noticing and redirecting becomes daily work. They notice the pattern activating. Oh, there it is. The urge to drop everything, the compulsion to help beyond capacity. They notice and they redirect. They don't have to follow the urge. They can choose differently. How they can slip back and recover more quickly shows real progress. They slip, fall, completely into old pattern for a day or a week. Then they notice. They course correct. They return to themselves. The recovery is faster than it used to be. The slip isn't permanent. The triggers that activate old pattern are familiar. Stress, criticism, rejection, uncertainty, feeling unworthy. Any of these can trigger the old belief that they need to prove their value through giving. Knowing the triggers helps them prepare. The lifelong nature of this work is accepting. This isn't temporary practice. This is how they'll live for the rest of their life, noticing the pattern, choosing differently, recovering when they slip. The work never ends, but it becomes more familiar, more possible. How awareness creates choice even when pattern activates is the key shift. The pattern activates, they feel the pull, but awareness means they can choose whether to follow it. They can feel the urge and not act. The awareness is the gap where choice lives. The self-compassion needed when they slip prevents shame spiral. They slip into old pattern. Instead of brutal self-criticism, they offer compassion. Of course they slipped. They're under stress. The pattern is deeply ingrained. They're doing their best. The compassion allows them to recover rather than spiral. The progress measured in recovery speed, not perfection, is realistic metric. They're not perfect. They still slip, but they recover faster. They notice sooner. They're gentler with themselves. The recovery speed is the progress. The acceptance of ongoing practice releases pressure. They're not trying to be perfect, not trying to eliminate the pattern completely, just trying to work with it consciously, to notice it, to choose when possible. The acceptance makes the work sustainable. The pattern remains. Living with the pattern means understanding some conditioning runs so deep that elimination isn't realistic. But conscious relationship with the pattern, awareness of when it's driving behavior, choice about whether to follow it, this is possible, and this is enough. In that consciousness, in that growing capacity to choose, something becomes possible that wasn't before. The deepest truth is this: learning to love themselves doesn't mean they stop loving others. It means they finally include themselves in the circle of beings worthy of their own care. It means the love they offer can be sustainable, genuine, freely given, rather than desperately performed. Integration of all parts becomes possible: the giver and the self, the wounded and the healing, the part that wants to help everyone and the part that needs care. All of it can coexist. All of it can be held. They don't have to choose between loving others and loving themselves. They can do both. How they can be both generous and boundaried is the integration. Generosity and boundaries aren't opposites. They can give generously and still have limits, can care deeply and still protect themselves, can be helpful and still prioritize their own needs. Both are true simultaneously. The possibility of loving others from fullness instead of depletion changes everything. When they love from fullness, they have something genuine to offer. The love is clean, not contaminated by resentment, not desperate, not obligatory. Just love freely offered because they have capacity to offer it. How including self in their care makes them more capable of caring well is the paradox. By including themselves, they have more to give. By taking care of themselves, they can take care of others better. By loving themselves, they can love others more sustainably. The paradox resolves in lived experience. The grief and liberation of the journey coexist. Grief for years lost to self-abandonment. Grief for relationships lost to change. Grief for younger self who suffered, and also liberation. Liberation from compulsive giving. Liberation from others' expectations. Liberation into authenticity. Both grief and liberation are real. Understanding this is ongoing practice, not destination. Releases pressure. They're not trying to arrive somewhere, not trying to be finished, just trying to practice every day, to notice, to choose, to include themselves. The practice is the point. How they're learning to be human rather than perfect allows gentleness. They don't have to get it right every time, don't have to never slip, don't have to be perfect at loving themselves. They just have to be human, have to keep trying, have to show up for themselves imperfectly. The relationships that can hold all of them become the ones that matter. Relationships where they can be generous and boundaried, where they can give and receive, where they can be helpful and needy, where all of them is welcome. These relationships are rare but real. The life that becomes possible when they matter to themselves is bigger than they imagined. They have energy for things they want to do, have capacity for relationships that nourish them, have space for their own life instead of living through everyone else's. The life is theirs now. The opening into future that includes them shows possibility. The future doesn't have to be more of the same, doesn't have to be endless giving and depletion. They can be in the future, can matter in their own life, can be both generous and self-caring. The future includes them now. They finally matter to themselves. The pattern of loving others more than themselves doesn't disappear, but it becomes something they work with rather than something that works them. They notice when they're abandoning themselves. They catch themselves before complete erasure. They return to themselves after departures. The return becomes more familiar than the leaving, and in that practice of returning, they discover something they've never truly known. They discover they can love others deeply while also loving themselves, that the two are not opposites, that including themselves in their own care doesn't make them selfish, it makes them whole. This wholeness is not perfection. It includes the wounded parts and the healing parts and the parts still learning. It includes the generous heart and the need for boundaries. It includes the capacity to give and the necessity of receiving. All of it together, all of it held. And in that holding, they learn what they were never taught, that they were always worthy of their own love, always deserving of their own care, always entitled to exist as more than just giver, more than just helper, more than just the one who loves everyone except themselves. They learn slowly and imperfectly that they can be both, generous and boundaried, caring and self-protective, loving to others and loving to themselves. The work is ongoing. The pattern will call them back. But now they have choice. And in that choice, in that small but profound capacity to include themselves, they find what they've been seeking in everyone else. They find home, not in another person, but in themselves, finally, imperfectly, enough. But finding home in themselves doesn't mean the journey is simple or the destination is clear. The process of learning to include themselves in their own care, of building life where they matter as much as everyone else matters, unfolds slowly across time. There are setbacks and revelations, moments of clarity and moments of profound confusion, days when the new way feels possible, and days when the old pattern feels inevitable. What they discover is that change happens in layers. The first layer is recognition, seeing the pattern clearly for what it is. The second layer is decision, choosing to do something different. But there are deeper layers beneath these, layers of grief that must be processed, layers of belief that must be dismantled brick by brick, layers of relationship pattern that must be renegotiated or released. Each layer takes time to work through, and there's no skipping ahead to the end. The grief they carry is complex and multifaceted. There's grief for the childhood they didn't have, where their needs would have mattered, where they would have been loved unconditionally, where they could have learned early that they were inherently worthy. This grief has no clear object, because they're grieving an absence, something that never existed. They can't remember what they're missing because they never had it. But the absence created a hole that shaped everything that came after. There's also grief for all the relationships they stayed in too long, gave too much in, accepted too little from. Relationships where they were used, where they were taken for granted, where their endless giving was met with minimal reciprocation. They grieve the years spent pouring themselves into connections that were never mutual, the energy expended on people who never actually cared about them the way they cared about those people. Another layer of grief is for the self they might have been. If they'd been taught differently, if they'd learned early that their needs mattered, who would they have become? What would they have pursued? What dreams would they have chased? This version of themselves exists only in imagination, but the grief for it is real. They mourn the unlived life, the unexplored possibilities, the paths not taken because they were too busy serving everyone else. The anger that surfaces during this process is often surprising in its intensity. They thought they'd dealt with their anger. They thought they'd processed it. But beneath the surface anger at specific people or situations, there's deeper anger at the system that created the pattern. Anger at a culture that praises selflessness, especially in certain people. Anger at family systems that require children to be emotional caretakers. Anger at the messages they internalized about their worth being conditional on their usefulness. This anger can feel dangerous. They've spent their entire lives being the calm one, the understanding one, the person who doesn't get angry. Allowing themselves to feel rage, to express it, to let it move through them without immediately suppressing it. This requires learning to tolerate an emotion they've been taught is unacceptable. The anger isn't polite, it isn't convenient, it isn't easy. But it's theirs, and it has information for them. What the anger tells them is that something was wrong, that what happened to them, the way they were conditioned, the patterns they learned, these things were harmful. The anger validates their experience in ways intellectual understanding cannot. It says, this wasn't okay. You deserved better. What happened to you mattered. The anger, when they can finally let themselves feel it, becomes a kind of self-advocacy they've never experienced. Processing this anger doesn't mean expressing it at everyone who harmed them. Some of those people are no longer in their life. Some wouldn't understand even if confronted. Some are dealing with their own wounds and patterns. The anger doesn't need to be delivered to its original targets to be processed. It needs to be felt, acknowledged, honoured, and eventually integrated. It needs to inform their boundaries going forward without controlling their behaviour. The shame that accompanies this journey is perhaps the most difficult emotion to work with. Shame about needing help. Shame about having been weak enough to let people use them. Shame about not recognising the pattern sooner. Shame about the relationships they stayed in, the boundaries they didn't set, the times they abandoned themselves. The shame whispers that they should have known better, should have been stronger, should have figured this out years ago. Working with shame requires distinguishing it from guilt. Guilt says, I did something wrong. Shame says, I am something wrong. Guilt can be productive. It points to behaviour that needs to change. Shame is toxic. It attacks fundamental worth. Much of what they feel is shame masquerading as guilt. They blame themselves for the pattern, for not stopping it sooner, for participating in their own abandonment. But they were doing the best they could with what they learned. They were surviving, learning to offer themselves compassion instead of criticism when shame arises is ongoing practice. When shame says, you should have known better, compassion responds, you were doing your best with what you learned as a child. When shame says, you're weak for letting people use you, compassion responds, you were taught that your worth came from service. When shame says, you should be further along by now, compassion responds, healing happens at its own pace. The practice of self-compassion feels awkward and forced at first. They're so used to harsh self-judgment that kindness toward themselves feels false, performative, like they're letting themselves off the hook. But over time, with repetition, self-compassion begins to feel more natural. They start to internalize a kinder voice. The inner critic doesn't disappear, but it gets quieter, or at least they get better at not believing everything it says. Another dimension of the healing process is learning to recognize and challenge the cognitive distortions that keep the pattern in place. All or nothing thinking. Either they give everything or they're selfish, catastrophizing. If they set a boundary, everyone will abandon them. Mind reading. Assuming they know what others think without asking. Emotional reasoning. If they feel guilty about saying no must be wrong. These distortions run constantly beneath conscious awareness, shaping perception and choice. Challenging these distortions requires catching them in action, noticing when they're engaged in black and white thinking, questioning assumptions about what will happen if they prioritize themselves, checking whether they're actually reading minds or making assumptions, testing whether feelings are reliable guides to reality. The cognitive work supports the emotional work, creating multiple entry points for change. The physical healing that can occur when they start including themselves in their own care is sometimes dramatic. The chronic tension begins to release. The persistent fatigue starts to lift. The illnesses that appeared when they finally rested become less frequent. The body, which was signaling distress for years, begins to settle as they learn to listen to it. This doesn't happen overnight. The body needs time to trust that things are different now, that its signals will be heeded, that it's safe to relax. Reconnecting with the body's wisdom requires learning to interpret signals they've been ignoring for years. Hunger isn't just physical sensation, it's information about need. Fatigue isn't weakness to be overcome, it's request for rest. Pain isn't inconvenience to be pushed through, it's message that something requires attention. Pleasure isn't indulgence, it's guidance toward what nourishes. Learning to listen to the body is like learning a language they once knew but forgot. The practice of checking in with the body becomes a regular part of their day, pausing to notice, how do I feel right now? What does my body need? Am I hungry, tired, tense, uncomfortable? The checking in creates connection between mind and body that's been severed. It brings them back into their physical experience instead of living entirely in their head, managing everyone else's needs. As they heal, they also begin to understand the difference between healthy helping and compulsive helping. Healthy helping comes from overflow, from genuine desire, from having capacity to give. It's boundaried, sustainable, reciprocal. Compulsive helping comes from need to be needed, from fear of rejection, from belief that worth must be earned. It's boundaryless, depleting, one-sided. The same action, helping someone, can be healthy or compulsive depending on the motivation and the context. Learning to discern their own motivation before helping becomes important practice. Someone asks for help. Before automatically saying yes, they pause and check in. Do I actually want to help? Do I have capacity? Am I helping from genuine care or from fear of saying no? Is this request reasonable? Is this relationship reciprocal? The pause creates space for conscious choice instead of automatic compliance. They also learn to recognize when help isn't actually helpful. Sometimes what people need isn't someone to do things for them, but space to figure it out themselves. Sometimes offering help enables dysfunction instead of supporting growth. Sometimes helping prevents natural consequences that would create change. Learning when to help and when to allow someone to struggle is nuanced skill that develops over time. The relationships that survive their transformation are often surprising. Some people they thought would leave actually stay and celebrate the change. Some people they thought would support them resist fiercely. The unpredictability of others' reactions teaches them that they cannot base choices on trying to predict or control others' responses. They can only make choices aligned with their own well-being and let others respond however they will. Building new relationships from healthier foundation feels different from anything they've experienced. Meeting people as person with boundaries, with needs, with expectations of reciprocity. This creates different dynamic from the beginning. They're not immediately giving everything. They're not hiding their needs. They're not performing endless availability. They're showing up as whole person who both gives and receives. The relationships that form from this foundation are more balanced from the start. What they discover is that healthy people don't want them to be endlessly giving. Healthy people actually appreciate boundaries because boundaries create safety. Healthy people want to give back because reciprocity feels good. Healthy people don't want to use them, they want to know them. This is revelation. They thought everyone wanted them boundaryless and endlessly available. Turns out the people worth having in their life want something different. The practice of receiving becomes just as important as the practice of giving. When someone offers care, they practice saying thank you instead of immediately deflecting or reciprocating. When someone gives a compliment, they practice accepting it instead of minimizing. When someone wants to help, they practice allowing it instead of insisting they're fine. Receiving is vulnerable. It requires trusting that people care about them, not just what they provide. Learning to ask for help directly, instead of hoping someone will notice they're struggling, is frightening and liberating. Asking means acknowledging need. Acknowledging need means risking rejection. But asking also means respecting both themselves and others enough to be clear. It gives people the opportunity to show up for them. Many people want to help but don't know how, or don't realize help is needed. Asking makes it possible for care to flow. The first times they ask for help and receive it are profound experiences. Someone says yes, shows up, provides care without making them feel guilty, doesn't bring it up later as debt owed, just helps because they care. This contradicts every belief about needing to earn care, about help being burden, about having to be strong alone. The experience creates new neural pathway. Asking for help can be safe. People can give without expecting repayment. They can receive without owing. As they build capacity to include themselves in their own care, they notice changes in how they move through the world. They say no more often. They ask for what they need more directly. They leave situations that aren't good for them more quickly. They tolerate others' disappointment more easily. They prioritize their own well-being more consistently. The changes are subtle at first, then increasingly obvious. They're taking up more space, advocating for themselves more clearly, existing more fully. The people who knew them before sometimes comment on the change. Some say they seem healthier, stronger, more present. Others say they've become selfish, different, not who they used to be. Both observations are accurate. They are different. They're no longer abandoning themselves to please everyone. The difference is that they now see the change as growth rather than failure. They're not who they used to be. And that's exactly the point. There's grief in letting go of the old identity, the helper, the selfless one. the person everyone could count on for anything at any time. That identity felt important. It gave them purpose and value. Releasing it means finding new sources of worth, new ways to matter, new understanding of who they are. The new identity is less defined, more fluid, still forming. This ambiguity is uncomfortable but also full of possibility. What they're learning is that they can matter without being useful, can be valued without being needed, can be loved without earning it through service. These truths feel revolutionary because they contradict everything they learned. They're not just changing behavior, they're changing fundamental beliefs about their worth, their place in the world, their right to exist. The ongoing practice becomes integrating all the parts of themselves, the part that genuinely loves helping people, the part that needs to protect their energy, the part that feels guilty about boundaries, the part that knows boundaries are necessary, the part that wants to give, the part that needs to receive. None of these parts are wrong. All of them are real. Integration means making room for all of it. They learn they don't have to choose between being generous and being boundaried. They can be both, can help people and protect themselves, can care deeply and maintain limits, can be loving and self-protective. The both and replaces the either or. They're not abandoning their generous nature. They're adding self-care to it. The practice of returning to themselves after each departure becomes the central skill. They slip back into old pattern. Someone needs them and they give everything, abandon themselves completely. Then they notice, oh, there it is again, the pattern. And instead of shame spiral, they simply return to checking in with themselves, return to honouring their needs, return to including themselves. The return is what matters, not the fact that they left. Over time, the returns become more frequent and the departures become shorter. They still slip, still fall into old pattern, but they notice faster, return quicker. The pattern's hold loosens, not because it disappears, but because their relationship to it changes. They're not controlled by it anymore. They're working with it. What becomes possible as the pattern loosens is a life they couldn't have imagined before. A life where they matter to themselves as much as others matter, where their needs are included in the equation, where they can be generous from choice rather than compulsion, where they have energy for their own life instead of living through everyone else's, where they're known rather than just useful, where they're whole. This wholeness includes all of it, the wounds and the healing, the pattern and the awareness, the generous heart and the necessary boundaries, the capacity to give and the willingness to receive, the old conditioning and the new choices, all of it held together in messy, imperfect, beautiful integration. And in that integration, they discover something profound. They discover that learning to love themselves doesn't make them less loving toward others. It makes their love more sustainable, more genuine, more free. It allows them to give from fullness rather than depletion, from choice rather than obligation, from generosity rather than desperation. They learn that including themselves in the circle of beings worthy of their care isn't selfish, it's necessary. It's what allows them to show up for others consistently, authentically, without resentment. It's what makes their care sustainable over lifetime instead of burning out after years. The journey from loving others more than themselves to loving both others and themselves is long and non-linear. There are setbacks and breakthroughs, moments of clarity and moments of confusion, days of progress and days of regression. but the direction is clear. They're moving toward wholeness, toward integration, toward a life where they finally include themselves, and that inclusion changes everything. It changes how they relate to others, how they make choices, how they spend their energy, how they define their worth, how they move through the world. It changes them from someone who exists to serve into someone who exists fully, completely, as whole person deserving of their own care. The pattern of loving others more than themselves will always be part of them. It formed too early, ran too deep, shaped too much to ever completely disappear. But it doesn't have to control them. They can notice it, work with it, choose differently, include themselves, return to themselves, again and again. And in that practice of returning, of including, of choosing themselves alongside others, they find what they've been searching for all along, not in another person, not in being needed, not in endless giving, but in themselves. Finally coming home, finally mattering, finally worthy of their own love, imperfect, ongoing, enough.